Welcome to the Jacob's Ladder Podcast, where we talk about loving God, loving others, and loving ourselves at work and at home. Today is an interview episode where we're going to be talking with Alan Noble. And this is episode 229, and this is an excellent interview. It's about a book called On Getting Out of Bed, and it deals with sadness, and which includes mental health, but includes other issues. It's a very rich discussion, and it ended up being a little bit longer, and so I broke it up into 2 episodes. So this is the first of 2 episodes. So let's get right to the interview. Hello, Alan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great. Great. Thanks so much for joining the conversation today. We're going to be talking about your book on getting out of bed, but I would like to start out by just introducing you to our audience a bit. Can you share with us kind of a fairly brief testimony focusing primarily around your faith?
Sure, yeah. So I was born into a Christian family and raised in the church, baptized very young, and in a sort of Pentecostal tradition, charismatic tradition, and grew up Assemblies of God, and really came into my faith in my teenage years, and it sort of took off from there. I don't have a sort of turning point conversion narrative per se. But in my teenage years, I would say that's when I started to make my faith my own, as it were.
So would you say, as part of that kind of quote unquote boring testimony, which I think, which are wonderful to hear, I mean, do you think you avoided a lot of the bad choices that some of us made that we had to deal with for the rest of our life? I mean, in general, would you say that's true? And I'm sure you don't have any regrets if that's true, but I just like to pick people's brains around that, because some people have, difficult pasts that there's a lot to share about and God can redeem, and some people don't. And I kind of like to get perspectives from different viewpoints and different experiences.
I mean, I made some bad choices that I have regrets about, but I knew they were bad choices at the time, and then I repented and turned from them, and God brought me out of those things and healed me, and I moved on. It wasn't kind of a story of leaving God, I would say, right? It was a story of being with God and being in disobedience, and knowing I was in disobedience and struggling to come into submission. But it was never an attitude of, I'm going to leave you, God, and I don't want anything to do with you. So that, that's my story.
Thanks for sharing that. And this is one of those things that we could go off on a tangent on, but I want to get to our book. But thanks for sharing that with us to give us a little bit of background. So your book is called On Getting Out of Bed, and this really touched me. I've been going through a difficult phase of life, going through a divorce and battling sadness and heaviness. But honestly, I've dealt with the sadness and heaviness off and on at different times, sometimes worse due to circumstances, my whole life. And I'm in my 50s now, and so I'm doing a little bit of, a lot of self introspection, you might say. Anyway, this book just came at just the right time, because this topic has been on my heart a lot. And so I just wanted to share that briefly. But let's start with something you said early in your book, which I think is important as kind of a foundation. You talked about your early assumptions about the way life was supposed to be. And it was kind of from the perspective, you could say, of what you might say the bias of Job's friends in the story of Job. And I'm going to just read a brief section from your book. It says, I assumed that outside of my circle, I would discover that most adults live fairly pleasant and safe lives, not perfect lives, not without difficulties and accidents, but generally pleasant, comfortable lives. A good job, a fulfilling marriage, an exciting sex life, a photogenic family, a sense of accomplishment, a new phone, not too much debt, reasonably good health, an abiding sense of happiness, solidly middle class, very Christian, a pleasant life, a normal life, a life I could have. And then and then you said that you realized that those assumptions were wrong. But I like to how you kind of summarize that way of thinking is that normal life is a pleasant life for those who merit it. Talk about those assumptions if you could, and why you found those to be wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, as I say at the beginning of the book, I grew up around a lot of suffering, but I thought that that suffering was an anomaly. I thought that the normal life was, as you just read, a pleasant life, that most people lived pleasant lives. Most adults seem to, as we like to say, have it together. They seem to be pretty happy, and they seem to be pretty content, and they had nice things, and they seemed to be doing well for themselves. And so my assumption was that a normal life was a pretty good life, and by a good life I meant a pleasant life, a comfortable life, and that was the norm. And part of this is coming from society, right? Society is trying to sell us this image that you can have this pleasant, comfortable life if you just buy enough things and get enough services. If you have enough money, you can purchase yourself this pleasant life. And so part of it was coming from a sort of consumerist society that was selling this vision of middle class success. But part of it was just running into people, and honestly, I think part of it was coming from the church, right? Sometimes Christians, not sometimes, many times Christians hide their suffering and don't want to share it because they feel like it's a sign of their weakness or a sign of sin in their lives. And maybe sometimes it is sin, but still we need to bear each other's burdens, and it's important to be open and with prudence. And but sometimes you can go to church and not get the impression that anyone is having any suffering in their lives at all, that everyone is just, as they say, happy and clappy. And then you feel like the outsider, you feel like this alien. It feels like you're the only one who's having a hard time. And so I grew up in this environment where everyone seemed to have it together. And so my assumption was, okay, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to put my life together. And if I just work hard enough, if I do the right things, as long as I, go to the right school, marry the right person, keep my nose clean, I should merit a good life. And what really started, first of all, I had my own mental health issues, which I don't know that I'll go into, but those threw me for a loop, because I didn't ask for those, and they just hit me, and they're there, and I didn't merit them. There's nothing I did to cause them. There's nothing anyone did, I don't think, that really caused them. They're just there. But then the other thing that really caused me to question this assumption was getting into small group Bible studies with other adults who are older than me when I was in my early 20s, and meeting and talking to so many people who had kids and who are more progressed in life, the kind of people I identified as the people who had it all together. And then just, hearing their prayer requests and realizing, oh my gosh, they don't have it all together. In fact, they're struggling with serious problems. Like their kids have serious problems. They have serious problems. Their marriage has serious problems. Their mental health, their physical health. There are so many things that they're going through. Life is not a pleasant life always. Life is still good. I'm not saying that life is not good and a good gift, and I stress that in that book. But I was believing a lie that a normal life is a pleasant life if you just hustle hard enough.
Well, and to kind of build on that, you made the comment that if you get to know someone really well, you'll find someone who routinely struggles to get out of bed. I thought that was quite a statement because it suggests that this is really, really common. How would you, I mean, do you have any statistics or just anecdotal thoughts to kind of support how common it is for someone to literally struggles to get out of bed?
Yeah, I have no statistics. This is just purely anecdotal, just based on my experience talking with students. As a college professor, I get to talk with a lot of students who are going through a lot of things, and as a friend to a lot of people, and someone who has walked with other people going through things, and just knowing what they're experiencing. There's either a literal difficulty getting out of bed or figurative. Sometimes they're able to get out of bed, but they slump down in a kitchen chair and they struggle to get up and eat breakfast. Maybe they get stuck somewhere else, but there's maybe they get stuck in the shower, ruminating over what to do with their problems. Right. But there's this stuckness that's caused by despair, by fear, by anxiety, by depression, that a lot of us experience because life is hard. Right. And that's part of the core of this book is what the church has taught for thousands of years, what humans have known forever, which is actually life is really hard and you have to be resilient and you have to know how to navigate the difficulties of life.
And when you say life is hard, I've been thinking about this, reading your book and just in general, to kind of put this into some perspective as to why life is hard. It seems to me life is hard for multiple reasons. One of them is it's a fallen world. So sin is in the world. It's not as it should be. As a believer, I think we all agree with that. Another reason is life can be harder than it needs to be based on choices we make. I think we can all agree on that. I've found that life is hard individually for maybe two reasons. In addition to those I just mentioned, and one of them is some form of brokenness mentally. Okay, and I feel like there's something about my makeup that's made me prone to sadness, and I don't understand it, and I don't know anyone I've ever talked to who fully understands it. But I think there's an aspect to that affects people in different ways. And then another area I've thought about that I've kind of gotten through some therapy and counseling is this idea that we all have different temperaments or personalities that aren't necessarily broken. It's just how we're made. But some of those personalities or temperaments are maybe more prone to sadness in response to situations than others. What are your thoughts on that theory I just threw out there?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. What I like about the theory is that it's multi-causal. It's not saying that there's just one thing that explains all of these problems. I mean, the other thing that I would add is that there's a spiritual element to this is as well. That spiritual attacks are real. I have found that I believe that that Satan doesn't want me, that Satan would rather me be stuck in my head ruminating than doing good work, caring for my family and writing or ministering to students or doing any other things that glorifies God. And I think that so I'm not saying that whatever I struggle with can be completely reduced to spiritual attacks, but I'm saying I just want to make space for that too, that dimension, because I think as modern Westerners, we want to reduce everything to just material explanations and say, well, everything is just the material world, is just, psychology or, biology. And I want to say, well, there's that, but also we have an enemy, and he really does want to prevent us from glorifying God with our lives. And so I think that's an aspect of it too that I would add. But I don't really understand personalities. They're strange to me. For example, up until about, 3 or 4 years ago, I was somewhat extroverted, and now I've become fairly introverted, and I have no idea, and I don't quite understand why. I didn't even know that could change. So I don't understand personalities. they don't quite make sense to me.
Well, and I don't, all with all due respect to the psychology profession, it seems like to me that they're doing the best they can, but that they're doing the best they can, and they're trying to make
Yeah,
sense out of things that are
that's
very
right.
difficult to make sense out of. And you
Yeah.
could say that to some degree about the medical profession, but even more with psychology. So I'm kind of with you on that. But I wanted to thank you for bringing up the spiritual attack, because I really didn't list that in my list, and that is so true. And I do. The more I live, the more I realize the value of balance, and that truth seems to be found mostly in balance. We want so much to just explain away things, especially big things that impact us in a big way, with something simple, like it's all because of this, and that can be good, bad, or somewhere in between. Like if we want to just blame it on someone else, that's probably not good. If we want to blame it on ourselves, that's probably not good either. So I do think there's the ultimate answer is balanced among all those things. Would you agree?
Yeah. 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 I think it's multi-causal. Yeah. There's lots of things at work.
Describe the promise of technique in our society that you mention. What is it, and why should be aware of it, and not to let it impact our thinking too much about our situations and our sadness?
Yeah, so I'm taking this term technique from a French sociologist named Jacques Ellul, Christian sociologist. And by technique, he means any method of maximizing efficiency. And we see technique everywhere in society, from the best practices for doing laundry to washing dishes to, um, you know, pumping gas to doing your taxes to making your bed to just every asset, exercising, dieting, raising your kids, potty training, literally anything you can think of. There is a most efficient way. There is a technique to maximize efficiency. And the promise of technique is that through efficiency, we can live a better, more productive, joyful, pleasant life. We just have to find the right technique. That whatever problems we're encountering because we haven't found the right technique. And so if we find the right technique, then we can solve it. And this creates this problem that actually adds to our sadness, because what it means is if I'm feeling sad, that's because I haven't found the right technique. And if I find the right technique, if I find the right self-help book, if I find the right therapist, if I find the right guidance, if I find the right, whatever it might be, meditation, the right medication, the right whatever, then I'll find the right thing, and then I'll be okay and everything will be fine. And I'm here to say that sometimes we just have to bear through things. And I never want to, discourage people from advocating for themselves. You do need to advocate for yourself and pursue health. What I'm saying is that techniques promise puts the blame on us. It says your problems are because you are inadequate, that you are not trying hard enough, that you are not doing enough. And that just makes us feel more shame.
Well, one of the things that made me think about was through the journey I've been in, particularly recently, was I've been counseled by several just to remember that I am not in control of everything, because my tendency is to want to try to fix everything. And 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 this, what you're saying basically, is also a reminder that I didn't create every negative situation in my life or every negative feeling I have, and I don't have the ability myself to completely fix it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. God is sovereign. You are not.
Yeah, he is God and I am not. That's one of those simple lessons. It's sounds good, but we just have to keep reminding ourselves of it.
Yeah, it's hard to sink in.
You said something in the book that I thought was interesting. I'd like to hear more on your thoughts on it. And you said that sometimes anxiety and depression will actually be rational and moral responses to a fundamentally disordered environment. Talk to me more about what you mean by that and why it's important to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the world long enough and carefully enough, it's hard not to come away feeling anxious and depressed. I think it's rational to come away anxious and depressed. I think as Christians that we have a greater hope so that we don't need to stay there. But I think when you consider things like wars and abortion and polarization and infighting in the church and um, injustices and greed and so much sin, rampant sin in our society and within the church and abuse within the church and all these sorts of things, um, a kind of sadness is a moral response, um, a sense of grieving for what is going on. And when you experience the dehumanizing effects of society, the way society treats you as a cog in a machine, refuses to treat you as a full human being, it makes sense that you feel anxious and on edge. And so I think in some ways it's a rational and moral response. I don't think that's where we stay. I think as Christians we have a higher calling than that. I think that we have a higher hope than that. But I think in a way, it's a rational moral response.
Well, and what I like about that is it maybe prevents us from focusing on the anxiety or the depression too much and making too much of it. In other words, oh, something is totally wrong with me, or why am I feeling this way? And it may drive us back to that pursuit of the right technique or what have you. And the other thing I thought about as you're saying it was when you say that's not where we stay, I would think that that's true in a couple of ways. In other words, not just, okay, we don't want to stay here like as a general rule. We want to have a different attitude and focus on the hope that we have through the promises of God. But I think that reminder not to stay is not just a one-time thing. It's, as life goes on, it's still not going to be perfect on this side of a glorified body. And so we're going to have these feelings and these situations. And so I think we have to more than once, but repeatedly remind ourselves that, that when we feel a certain way, sometimes it's just a rational and moral response, not make too much of it and go on go on and move forward. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. You can, and and there's something comforting in that, and reminding yourself, I'm not crazy. It's not weird that I'm feeling this way. This is really sad. This is really anxiety producing. This environment is not. In my second book, You Are Not Your Own, I talk about this issue of technique and this environment that I basically tease out this idea at length in the first half of the book, and try to argue that this environment that we're living in is not designed for humans as God made us, and so because of that, we're going to naturally feel a lot of anxiety, and so you're not. It's not weird that you're feeling this way. It's natural, and that there's a comfort in that. But then, as you say, what you want to do then is ground yourself in some biblical truths and move on, not dwell on that, because that just sort of feeds it and nurtures some negative things that are not healthy or helpful.
Well, on this topic of balance, one of the things you said in the book was that that while we can be helped by medication and therapy and self-care, we still all have to choose each morning to get out of bed. In other words, to live. Why is that choice ultimately unavoidable? Why is that always part of the situation or part of the solution?
So this is an essential part of my book is this, what I would call a kind of existentialist argument, that, behind all the medicalization of mental health and behind all the professionalization of mental health and behind all the self-help talk, at the end of the day, it comes down to a choice. We have choices that we have to make. And we have that agency. We have that agency to make those choices, and that's a hard thing to accept. And I recognize that not everyone has the same agency. Some people have severe mental illnesses that take away their agency, and so I want to make space for that. But for most of us, we have some measure of agency to make that choice to get out of bed, to do things, to move through our day, to live life, even though it hurts, even though it's really hard, and that's our duty. That's what we need to do, and so that's not to discount the use of psychology or psychiatry or self-help or all these other things, which can be really helpful, but it is to say that, gosh, at the end of the day, we really have to make a choice. We really have to make a choice. Am I going to get out of bed today? Am I going to act today? Am I going to make the choice to do the thing that's going to glorify God by getting out of bed? Now, there are times when we can feel so dark and so overwhelmed that we can't get out of bed. And that doesn't mean that we're failing God. There's grace for those moments too. And in those moments, what I would say is your act of glorifying God is turning to a friend, is calling someone, texting someone, appealing to help for someone. That is an act of glorifying God, is recognizing your weakness and recognizing you need help. But there's always a choice that you can make. And however small that choice is, that's a choice that you can make. And that's beautiful and glorifying to God.
Well, and you said that one of the results of if you don't accept what you've just stated is that we can put too high of an expectation or an unrealistic expectation on these psychological treatments that might be available. Is that right?
Yeah, unfortunately, because we live in this sort of professional age, we have this hope that psychology and psychiatry are these sort of magical cures that we can go in, and if we get a diagnosis, then there must be a cure, that there must be some discrete answer that can fix my problem and cure me. But if you've been in therapy long for any amount of time, you know that that's not how it works for most of us. There are exceptions, but for most people, it's a lifelong process of working through things, and improvement and growth. And if you're not seeing improvement or growth, you should try a different provider. But still, it's not a one and done thing. It's not like, antibiotics when you have, some ear infection or something. It's much more nuanced than that. And and so it's important that you don't have these unrealistic expectations. And it's not fair to therapists and psychiatrists to have unrealistic expectations about what medication and therapy can do. It's not fair to them because you're putting this unrealistic standard upon them. You know, so I think going into them, you need to realize that there's only so much that they can do. And your task is to be an advocate and fight for healing and pray for healing and work toward that, do the work. But know that it is work and it takes time.
Well, you also said kind of all along that the topic of nuance is that there's really no way for us to know or to say concretely, X percentage of my problem is due to biological, X of it is because I'm not making the right choices. There's just no way to know that, right? So a better approach is to accept that we don't know, get help if we can, if it actually does help, and realize that our own choices that God has given us, this free will, is a part of the solution.
Yeah, this is one of the weird things, one of the super hard things about mental illness. And the example I give in the book is of spinal fusion. When I was in grad school, I had spinal fusion done because I had some herniated discs in my neck. And I was in a neck brace, and I was told you can't lift more than, I think it was 10 pounds. And I had a newborn son at the time who was a kind of a chunky kid. He was a big newborn, and so I couldn't pick him up. And this was, frustrating for me. And but my wife was very understanding because she knew I couldn't help take care of him. I couldn't pick him up and help take care of him because it would risk undoing this surgery that was so costly and so important. And who knows what kind of damage could have been done. So it was a convenient thing because there was a line, there was a limit. I could say, this is where my limit is. I can't lift over 10 pounds. But with mental illness, there's no fine line. You don't know where your mental illness begins and where it ends. You don't know where your ability to choose begins and where the mental illness begins. You have to just do your best. You have to say, wherever I believe that I have agency, wherever I believe that I have the choice to act, I have the obligation to act in a way that is glorifying to God. And then you have to do that. And I've received some pushback on the book that I'm sort of blaming the victim or putting pressure on people who are already victims. But I believe this is an important message that people need to hear, because to get better, you have to advocate for yourself. You've got to be an advocate.
Well, I agree. Now, we haven't mentioned the S word, the suicide, yet in this discussion. I want to talk about that briefly, because you make the comment that this whole concept of choosing to not get out of bed, you could interpret that as, okay, I'm going to choose to actually live and not kill myself today, just to be blunt. But it certainly can be more than that. In other words, it doesn't have to be at that level. It can simply be, I'm making a choice to live and to embrace the idea that life is good. But let's talk about the suicide issue. And I wanted to touch on a book that you mentioned, which I have not read, and I'm intrigued, and I might choose to read it. It's called The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and suicide is a part of that story. Can you briefly talk about the lessons. Well, first of all, I guess give me your thoughts on what I just said as far as how this choice could be about not choosing to kill ourselves, but it goes beyond that. That's the first part. And then the second part is to talk a little bit about that book and some of the lessons we can learn from that book.
Yeah, so I think there are lots of ways that we choose not to live. And suicide is the most extreme way not to live. But I think choosing not to get out of bed is a way of choosing not to live sometimes, not always, but sometimes. You can choose not to live by just playing video games all the time and not embracing life by binge watching TV or scrolling endlessly on TikTok. There are lots of ways of what I would call giving up on life. Most of them involve continuing to live. And I think that's important to acknowledge, that there are lots of ways of doing that. And they're all forms of what I would call despair. You're giving up on life itself. The Road is a dystopian novel about the end of the world. About the end of the world. It's about a father and a son journeying down at the end of the world, where there are roaming bands of cannibals, and he's the father and is taking his son and trying to bring him to safety. At first, there is a wife, and the wife believes that there is no hope for them to ever meet other good guys and get to safety, and so she chooses to commit suicide, and she wants to take the son with her. And there's this debate about whether or not it is ethical, and the father chooses to believe, despite all the evidence in the world that everything is terrible, he chooses to believe that actually the world is good, that there is a divine command from God for him to care for his son and to continue living. And so I use that book as an example of the importance of choosing to live and embrace life despite suffering.
Well, that'll end the first part of this discussion, and I hope you've enjoyed this conversation so far. We'll have the second part in an upcoming episode soon. I hope you're feeling inspired to apply something you heard to better love God, love others, and or love yourself. I think, as you could probably tell, the focus of this discussion is probably heavy on the idea of loving ourselves and understanding ourselves better. And I just hope it's blessing you. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to our next time together. God bless.